So welcome everybody. My name is Shay Cronin. I'm a faculty member and I'm chair of the Applied Social Sciences Department here at BU's Metropolitan College. This event is really the result of an effort of a correctional reform working group. This group consists of many leaders and advocates in and around the justice system. It is led by an executive committee who really led the effort to organize tonight's event. This includes June Binney, Robert Cadigan, and Jim Matizant, who are faculty with me at BU, Jim Serco, John Larrabee, and Samantha Mariano. Many from the working group participated in planning tonight's event. I'm deeply grateful for all of their efforts, and I'm especially thankful for the assistance of Samantha, who has been invaluable in bringing us here tonight. From BU, I want to thank Vivian Tran, who helped with the executive committee to coordinate the many details of this event. We should also recognize the academic leadership of BU's Metropolitan College, Dean Zlatova and Chikuchev. Finally, I'd like to recognize our panelists and our moderator, Deborah Becker. You will learn more about them when they do their introductions in a few moments. Each has given their time and expertise not only here tonight, but also throughout the year in planning this event. They did so because they share a common aim that aligns well with the values of BU and Metropolitan College and the programs that are run. Together, we seek to educate future leaders in and around the criminal justice system, to inform and inspire those leaders to enact lasting change within that system, to improve the quality of the lives of those who are affected by it. This value has motivated our panelists throughout their professional careers and in their personal life. And I truly hope that this discussion I truly hope that you'll enjoy this discussion and that you'll get a lot out of it, and that especially our students in our programs will understand a better path forward. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Deborah Becker, who's graciously given her time to help moderate this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shay. Thank you, Boston University, for having this event tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming, both in person and virtually. This is really an amazing time in Massachusetts history, not just the state history, but correctional history. And I've been covering the criminal legal system in Massachusetts for several years, and I certainly heard mention of it, but I don't think I was completely aware of really how significant this time in the 1970s was in the history of the criminal legal system in Massachusetts, and really what kind of message it sent about corrections and about correctional reform around the country. So I hope you're going to learn a lot tonight about this. We have a terrific panel of folks who were really working on the ground on some of those reforms at the time. So you have primary sources of history here who will be talking about what was going on at the time. Also, we have a former correction commissioner with us who will be discussing how some of those reforms played out later after the 1970s. And we have a current undersecretary of the State Executive Office of Public Safety and Security who can tell us about what's happening now and where we go from here. So it's really a very informative event. I hope you'll learn a lot. We won't be able to fit it all in our time frame. So there is a great website that Sammy Mariano has created, so you can read further about some of these things if we don't get to them tonight. But there's a lot of information, and we hope that what you will take from it is a better understanding of a really important time in history, and also think about how things that are happening today are affected by that. Because I remember when I was first talking with these folks and they were saying things like reentry and making sure that there were vocational programs and educational programs, and they wanted to reduce incarceration. I thought, was this the 1970s? People were saying this, and what happened? And so we hope that you have some of those same questions, and we'll be able to answer some of those tonight, because it is very, very informative, and we can all take lessons from that going forward. First, what I'd like to do is tell you a few logistics. So we're going to talk with the panel, and then after the panelists and I have a discussion about that time in history. We're going to take questions from you, the audience, both those of you who are here in person and the folks who are joining us virtually. So feel free to ask a question to the panelists. We'll leave a little bit of time for that at the very end of our discussion. I want to start this off, though, with some remarks from the former State Secretary of Health and Human Services, Peter Goldmark. He was, in the cabinet at the time, and he was responsible and overseeing a lot of these changes at the time. And our discussion tonight is really looking at a man who was a reformer, who was probably 50 years ahead of his time, by the name of John Boone. He was the former correction commissioner in Massachusetts, the first Black correction commissioner in the state. And he had ideas, some of those ideas that I thought, wait a minute, was that the 1970s? He had those ideas in the 70s, and he was actually brought here to implement some of those ideas. So a lot of our discussion tonight will focus on John Boone, but the man responsible for his hiring was the former Secretary of the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. So some of you might be saying, what did that person have to do with corrections? Well, at that time, corrections was under the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. Now, of course, it's under the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security. So let's go to some comments from Peter Goldmark, the former secretary. I don't see it here. Someone's going to have to help me get on this. Thank you. Nope. There it is.
It's terrific to join a wonderful group like this one, good thinkers, thoughtful actors, some who are also wonderful friends, like John Isaacson, Paul Chernoff, and Jim Eisenberg, an absolutely critical actor and force in the reforms we mounted in Massachusetts in the early 1970s. What I want to do today is to share with you a few ideas and questions that we should think about as we discuss how to move forward. Criminal justice is a fundamentally important field in the American adventure in democracy and self-government. First of all, every citizen feels that he or she is an expert in it. It deals with what it means to be a citizen in a democracy. It deals with law breaking. It involves all the key ideas of what standards individuals should be held to, and what is society's responsibility to protect its members and to deal fairly, firmly, and constructively with offenders. When I was 30 years old, I was asked by a wonderful and progressive governor of your state, Frank Sargent, a Republican, to be his and the state's first Secretary of Human Services. And at that time, that meant that the Corrections Department reported to me. So like many of you, I have seen active duty in criminal justice reform, particularly the corrections, incarceration, rehabilitation part of it. Unlike most of you, I am now nearing the end of my years on this planet. I'm 82. But the conditions and the early tremors we are experiencing suggest we may once more be entering a period when serious change in those criminal justice systems may be possible. And in that spirit, I am not here to tell you what to do or how to do it. It's your at-bat, not mine. The attempt I was part of had some successes, but it ended, I would say, more in failure than in lasting positive change. My job is to encourage and support your emerging new effort. And as part of that, I will raise a few questions and ideas I think your effort might usefully consider. But I do that understanding that you must be the ones to decide which of these concerns make sense to pursue and which do not. Point one, most policies and decisions involving the corrections dimension of criminal justice are made at the state level in our federal system. And there is a good chance that the present divisions that characterize the federal legislative branch today will mean our Congress is not likely to be a productive center of useful reform. So let's make the primary focus of the next wave of reform the state and local levels from the beginning. Point two, I believe you will need what I call a generational strategy, which is something I recommend to the foundations I advise. When I was growing up and when I first entered public service, there were two generations, the older one and the younger one. And a generation lasted about 25 years in terms of their influence, the prevalence of their ideas, and so on. Today, there are 4 or 5 different generations on the field at the same time with different ideas, different objectives, and different styles. And the useful period of a generation's influence is more like 8 to 10 years. To be effective today, you must understand their differing outlooks, their distinct values and objectives. And because their influence grows and becomes important and then fades relatively quickly compared to the rhythms of the past, you need to build a big role in your reform movement for these younger generations who are moving toward their period of primacy but are not in it yet. Last and possibly most important, point 3, claim and define the narrative. Avoid the artificial polarization of the issue into softies versus tough realists. Maybe call the program Earning Your Way Back, something that indicates from its name and its first words that a lot is expected of each individual and that each participant must exhibit the discipline to change the pattern of their life. Make clear that the greatest danger is the sudden return of incarcerees to society with no bridge system of interim discipline steps to get ready for the real world. On that note, I thank you for listening, but more importantly, for thinking about how to unlock the next period of positive reform in an area that desperately needs it. Now the job of myself and others who have had their turn at bat is to follow you and support you. I'm ready.
Yeah. So a little inspiration there from former State Health and Human Services Secretary Peter Goldmark, who, as we said, was instrumental in hiring Correction Commissioner John Boone in the 1970s. But tough to admit, right, that a lot of those programs ended in failure. Yet that era contains a lasting legacy that we're going to talk about tonight. And we have with us someone who probably knows more about this time than anybody, and that is Associate Boston University Professor Emeritus Bob Cadigan, who is going to give us an overview of what was happening both nationally and locally at the time, so we can understand some of the context before our panel discussion. Bob?
Okay, so there's the, oh yeah, the clicker's great. Where, how do I
So
click?
just click. Click.
Nope,
There you go.
here we go, thank you, okay. So, good evening, everyone.
Only this button. This
Oh.
button just goes in.
Okay, can I see it up here on the monitor too, or I'm gonna come around?
Yeah. You get to turn it.
Okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation tonight. I think that we've had 2 wonderful introductions to our subject from Secretary Goldmark and from Deb Becker, who is one of my favorite reporters at WBUR. Okay, thank you.
Obviously, we couldn't do any of this without Sammy.
No, you're right. We can't. We can't. Yeah. And so for people of a certain age, she is our PFC wintergreen. Anybody remember Catch 22? Okay. She ran the entire European theater of operations. Okay. So our aim tonight is to basically educate current and future leaders, as Peter Goldmark said, and to recognize the impact that Commissioner Boone had on the system. And we hope that you will carry this forward into your careers in corrections, criminal justice, or just as informed citizens. I want to start with the section here on legitimacy, crisis, and change. This was the 1960s. And for some of you, this will be a flashback. For others, you will know what your great-grandparents lived through. But some of the key issues here were the civil rights movement and issues regarding civil rights, but also there were other issues. There was the women's movement, born in 1963 with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. There was the anti-war movement among youth. There was the Berkeley free speech movement. But what I want to talk about tonight specifically is the issues of racial injustice. A couple of quotes, and I'm not going to read them all here, but Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963, letter from Birmingham jail, famously said, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue." Again, very, very important point to remember here that Dr. King was very much concerned with speaking truth to power. Flip to 1964, Malcolm X, famously noted for the expression, "by any means necessary." And when he said that, he wasn't saying violence first, but he was saying that if nonviolence failed, if the federal government and state governments failed to secure rights, it seemed fair game for by any means necessary. In the 1966, Huey Newton co-founded the Black Panther Party, by its own definition, a socialist organization with a strong interest in defense of the Black community. And then we had a period, 1963 through 1969, which I remember very well. Some of you will never believe it happened. In that period, there were 35 major riots, civil disturbances, rebellions in American cities. Detroit was perhaps the most significant in 1967, in which there was 43 people were killed, and there was, in today's dollars, over $1 million worth of damage to the city of Detroit. 1968, the Kerner Commission, looking back on 1967, basically said that the urban unrest was due to poverty and institutional racism. So here are some of the challenges to the system, the criminal justice system. Inside the correctional systems, there was the question of what's sometimes called the prison birth of Black power. A number of the people that were instrumental in the Black Power movement were people who were incarcerated, members of the Black Panthers, others. There were others who came to Black power, Black consciousness through incarceration, came to consider themselves as political prisoners in some cases, and became very interested in the idea of, or the question of, prisoners' rights. Just some of the things that people were reading, and I can thank Arthur Bembury for alerting me to From the Dead Level, Malcolm X and Me, a while back, which I would buy if it didn't cost $500 as an out-of-print book. But again, some of the leading thinkers were widely read in prisons. People like George Jackson, Soledad brother, Huey Newton, and influencing the atmosphere within the walls. So these movements were based in prisoners' beliefs that constructive dialogues with authority were impossible. Prisoners' actions created situations that involved confrontation and risk, but to these activists seemed necessary to force change. And that was the environment into which John Boone stepped in terms of a radicalizing Black population in prisons and a quite apathetic older white population at the same time. During his tenure, the National Prisoners Reform Association attempted to establish a prison labor union at MCI Walpole. Other issues that were coming to the fore at this very moment, and I think some of us in this room remember these very well, crises that affected other systems within public safety, public health. Okay. Seen from Titicut Follies, a documentary on Bridgewater State Hospital, alerted people to the conditions under which people who were labeled as criminally insane were being held. Here is Danvers State Hospital, one of the old mental hospitals that really warehoused large parts of our population that became outmoded and was due to be replaced by community resources for the mentally ill, which unfortunately never developed as it should have. Here is the Lyman School for Boys, which was decommissioned by Jerome Miller, along with other institutions in 1970 through 1972. This is the context in which John Boone came to power. The most immediate influence on what was happening happened at Attica Prison in New York State. September 9th through September 13th, 1971. And I have to read this from my slides here because I wouldn't believe it if I weren't reading it. Okay. On September 9th, 1971, more than 1,000 prisoners revolted, seizing 39 guards as hostages and gaining control of the prison. 5 days later, the uprising ended in a bloody assault by law enforcement. 39 prisoners and hostages were killed, all by law enforcement gunfire. Prisoners were stripped naked and forced to crawl through a latrine and then to run down a hall between two rows of guards who beat them as they ran. What's less well known is how this started. It started out of a relatively minor incident on September 8th in one of the yards. It was poorly managed by correction officers. A man was taken back to his cell, probably over what was just horseplay. He was beaten. The rumor mill in the prison got going. Everybody was on edge that Monday morning. And when there were a few snafus in getting people through the gates, all hell broke loose. It wasn't a planned rebellion. It wasn't a planned protest. It arose because there was a breakdown in the correctional system at Attica on that day, or the day before. Our panel is going to be saying much more about this, but this launched a number of moves. There was a federal report called Crisis in American Prisons, published in December based on hearings that year. Judge Harry Elam of the Boston Municipal Court created the Citizens Committee Report on Criminal Justice, which is an excellent document, well worth reading. Governor Sargent in December announced a plan for reform of corrections. And that same month, he announced that John Boone had been selected for appointment. And again, we mentioned that Peter Goldmark was involved in that decision, as was Jim Eisenberg, who is sitting on our committee here. Then, right after Attica, within that same month, Walpole, there were meetings, rallies among the Walpole inmates, including a face that might be familiar. But again, there were a number of issues involved here at Walpole that had been festering for years and were now coming to the head. And I think you can get a sense that post-Attica, there was a lot of anxiety about what might happen in Massachusetts. Then, October 6, 1971, John Fitzpatrick, a well-respected commissioner of correction, was meeting with prisoners at MCI Walpole. He collapsed. He survived, he lived, but he retired after that. And that launched a nationwide search for his replacement. And you mentioned Jim Eisenberg led that national search for his successor. There's our notes on those reports from the. Then, John Boone is sworn in on January 17th, 1972. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because our speakers will be talking about this in greater detail. His tenure was marked by both conflict and success. He had a difficult relationship with the correction officers who walked out in 1972. Then in the summer, they brought a lawsuit against him, claiming he didn't meet the qualifications under the legislation to be commissioner. The legislature passed this Major Reform Act in 72. Then it was implemented in October. So these are the major principles in that act. Our panelists will be talking about those. And then March 73, major correctional officers strike at Walpole. That lasted until May. This is the era that's covered in the book When the Prisoners Ran Walpole, which is also, by the way, a much better picture of what was going on before the prisoners ran Walpole than you might expect. Just Jamie Bissonnette did a wonderful job looking at the early history leading up to that. June 1973, John Boone was forced to resign. His enduring legacy for us in Massachusetts is that he implemented elements of the Reform Act. He diversified corrections staff. He reformed the classification system, oversaw a massive expansion of community-based corrections and reintegration programs, closed the outdated East Wing at Concord Prison, which if you were a Concord inmate, I've been told you would be very glad about. And he inspired a next generation of correctional leaders. And then after he left, he was Community Affairs Director for WNAC-TV. He taught at Boston University and other schools, and he returned to Atlanta in 1979. So 1972 to 79, he stayed in Massachusetts and served us well there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for giving us an overview of that context. So obviously a very important time in history, a time I think that, you know, this, we have to remember, this was before Ferguson, Missouri, right? This was before George Floyd. This was before a lot of the incidents that we might now think of as things that prompted calls for change in the system. So I think John Boone was an amazing leader at the time, certainly way ahead of his time. But Walpole, this very dramatic incident at a state prison where correction officers walked off the job and prisoners actually ran Walpole, as the documentary suggests, was a very important event in that time period. And I think we wanted to show you a little bit of footage about what Walpole looked like in the 1970s. And we have a brief clip from the BBC that has some information about that. And we'd like to show that to you right now. I thought you had a clicker.
Walpole was probably one of the most dangerous prisons at that time. In an 18-month period, 20 people got murdered. I served 40 years, most of my time in Walpole. We ran the place for 12 weeks. Like, we put people in the kitchen, and the same thing with the hospital and everything. We had a school set up. We paid the teachers, because we had a whole educational plan and everything. It was amazing. The guards took the observer says anything. The observers may wrote a report of what they saw. Every day when their shift was over, then that was another thing that the guard was there.
We watched the men in Block 4 take their own count. Today, the representative is working in the company of a cadet guard and some civilian observers. The cadets are young trainees without uniforms. They are the only guards now that the old officers have walked out. In the old system, the guard took the count. He could mark a man absent if he was not standing in sight at his door for the full half hour.
And we are proven to society that we are capable and qualified to govern ourselves.
There were different gangs in Walpole that, under normal conditions, would have killed each other. So I would meet with guys, and the people that had to be under control, we had them under control. It was a major chore. I mean, we'd be up all night long, and then all day long negotiating. We were trying to do something good. We could have got meaningful rehabilitative programs. But the nature of the beast was, it ain't gonna be.
So powerful, right? Powerful segment there on what Walpole looked like. And I see Mr. DeLello in our audience tonight, so I'm glad he's with us to listen and maybe ask some questions as well. So that was the end of John Boone's era as Commissioner Correction in Massachusetts, and it was largely because of what happened at Walpole. And this was a man who came in and told the New York Times in the early 70s that probably only about 10% of the people held then actually belonged behind bars. And he felt that community programs and education and vocational training and other things could help people be more productive members of society, and they didn't need to be incarcerated or be held by the state. And of course, that was also at a time when the incarceration rate was much lower. I think it's about quadrupled since then. So our panel tonight is going to be talking about all of this. And as I said, these were some of the key players during that time. They were all very, very young, though, in the 1970s. And so they're going to be telling us about what happens then and their perspectives now that they've been able to reflect on that time and what lessons we might take from that going forward. So I'm very grateful to them for being here. And again, I'm going to give you some logistics. They're each going to tell us a little bit about their role at that time. Then we're going to talk. Then I'm going to open it up to questions. If you do have a question to our panelists at the end, raise your hand if you're with us in the live audience, and we'll give you a microphone so you can ask the question. If you're attending virtually, please pose a question in the chat and I'll be able to monitor it from here, and I'll try to get the questions to our panelists. So gentlemen, thank you. And thanks to all of you. We're going to start with Jim Circo, who is going to tell us about his role at the time and his thoughts about this very dramatic time in the history of Massachusetts corrections. Jim?
Thank you, Deb. I'm so honored to be here tonight at Boston University. We're here to discuss John Boone's administration and the lessons learned, but what brings me here tonight is that a combination of programs under his administration, which reduced recidivism rates from 29% to 9%, have virtually disappeared. That's a 68% reduction in expected return rates of inmates, and we're not using those programs today. My name is Jim Serco, and I spent about 17 years in the Department of Correction and the Executive Office of Human Services. I started in the research department in the administration of Correction Commissioner Jack Fitzpatrick. I rose through the ranks to become Assistant Secretary for Criminal Justice. Commissioner Fitzpatrick had a heart attack, not only negotiating with the inmates, but also negotiating with several unions, correction officers' unions. A group of us, including Boone's administration members, have over the past year researched and spent endless hours talking about the events of Boone's time in office. What I've learned and what you'll hear tonight is that Commissioner Boone cared deeply about the injustices contained within the system. He told a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. in June of 1972 that the correction system was extremely ineffective. He said that he was surprised to learn that coming to Massachusetts, he saw a system that was 30% Black when they represented only 3% of the population. He said in the same testimony, quote, "Built into our dehumanizing system, the institution metes out punishments on a daily basis, and this is only to be followed by society's punitive treatment of ex-offenders." During his time as commissioner, his most difficult time and challenge was that of his leadership of MCI Walpole. When Commissioner Boone introduced community observers in the spring of '73, it proved to be the last straw in a tumultuous relationship with the correction officers. The correction officers walked off the job, and I and other non-uniformed colleagues were ordered to run the institution. My colleagues and I weren't thinking about national discord or the implications of significant societal change. We were focused on walking into a closed society with 576 of the most serious offenders in the state without its police force. Weighing heavily on our minds was the massacre that left 43 dead in the maximum security prison at Walpole, at Attica, in September of '71, after a hostage taking by inmates. And even closer to home, the murders of Jim Souza and Al Baranowski 8 months earlier at MCI Norfolk in an inmate aborted escape attempt. It didn't go well at Walpole after the officers walked out in '73 and state police were ordered in to the institution 2 months later. The administration of John Boone is both an inspiration and a caution. John Boone was a change agent who seemingly couldn't reconcile his conviction of righting injustices while managing all the constituencies in a sprawling, troubled, and difficult system. For their part, the correction officers were hoping to drive Boone from office with their unlawful strike. John Boone, I've come to believe, also alienated a large group of his employees within his charge. To be sure, there were systematic failures and biases within those groups, but they also worked in the most difficult jobs under trying circumstances. Here's the good news. John Boone oversaw a rapid rise of community-based facilities under the most progressive reform legislation of a generation. If it wasn't for John Boone, MCI Shirley wouldn't have existed. I became superintendent of MCI Shirley. Helping inmates to return to the community was the job of a lifetime, and inmates who were released from Shirley were significantly less likely to return to prison. A focus on community-based corrections was the successful work of disruptors. Our hope, as you scatter about the country, is that a disruptor or two among you experience your own successes. Thank you for having me here today.
Okay, next, and I think I'm going to let you guys stay seated for this, just because I think it'll save us a little bit of time. We've got a lot of material to go through. So next is Arthur Bembury.
forward to that walk. Come on.
Arthur is the executive director of Partakers, which is a program, a reentry program for folks in Massachusetts. And he was also incarcerated in the 1970s and has a very unique perspective about that time. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. This is an amazing opportunity, and it's a privilege to be up here with my colleagues and my former landlords, okay? Listen, the 70s and the 60s were traumatic. I came into prison when I was 19, and I was at Walpole during the times that you've seen on the screen. For most of the part of being there, we were looking for a voice. You know when something's not right. You know when change has to be made. You know when you're getting served a dirty meal, if you will. So we were trying to find a voice, trying to find a way to have a dialogue. At that time, that pathway was not present. It wasn't possible. Some of the choices that folks made weren't the best choices, but they were the choices that we felt would lead to change. When John Boone came into the picture, we looked at him as a hero. We looked at him as a savior. Programs, education, furloughs, things that we thought would never be possible under the conditions that we were living in. From the inside, I want to say also that it created unlikely allies. You would never see a group of Black men and a group of white men from different areas with different views, very different polarized views, come together to form an alliance, asking for the same thing. When the prisoners ran Walpole, it wasn't what we thought it would be. And I have to be totally honest with you, in the beginning, it was a great idea. We just didn't know how hard the work was that they did. You had to cook food for 1,800 people. You had to do this, you had to do that. We were like, oh, you had to take count. So it wasn't as simple as we thought it would be, but also you have to realize that time, the violence that had erupted inside of the prison, when you don't have that structure, when you don't have that policing, then the lawlessness inside becomes rampant in ways that you wouldn't even imagine. Folks that had enemies or wanted to get at enemies that they couldn't get at before were now easily able to do that. I think there was a passage up there where we had 18 murders in 20 months or something like that. My next door neighbor made a bomb and blew himself up. To give you an idea, these are the times that we're living in. We're looking at handguns inside of the prisons. Okay. We're looking at inmates with handguns. So that particular era was something that needed change and reform, but the essentials to create it just weren't present. I want to say this also, that through the work of the 70s, for everything that's been done to where we are now, is probably one of the reasons that I sit before you as the executive director of a program called Partakers that focuses on people coming home from prison and attaching them to resources and reentry. I think that going forward, we've come a long way, but there's a lot more to be done. And I want to say also that it's also with the courageous work and help of the people that you see on this board that are before us, that a lot of those possibilities are even able to take place. In the beginning, it was all adversarial. There's never been a time where I sat on a board or a panel where everybody is trying to do something and we're all collaborating with one another. That is a change that is so important that brings us all to the table together as collaborators. Thank you.
All right, that was great. Our next person who's gonna, and we thought we'd let everyone present a little so you'll know who they are when we start asking questions. I think this is a good way for them to introduce themselves to you. And the next person I'm going to introduce is Judge Chernoff, who was the chair of the parole board at the time and also worked on a lot of these reforms that we're talking about. You might want to move that microphone a little bit closer to Judge Chernoff so everyone can hear him. And Judge, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your recollection of that time and some of your reflections since?
Thank you. I'm Paul Chernoff, and thank you for this honor. It really is an honor for me to be here. I was a judge in the District Court and the Superior Court of Massachusetts for about 33 years. And since I retired as a judge about 9 years ago, I have been teaching at Boston College Law School. I preside over arbitrations and mediations, and maybe the most important thing I do is that I represent veterans as fellow veterans for Veterans Legal Services. Before I was a judge in the district court system, I was chairman of the state parole board for 4 years. And during that period of time was the time that John Boone's period in corrections. So we overlapped at the same time, and I had the benefit of working with him. I'd like to focus for a moment on the year 1970, 1970. In 1970, I was in my third year as a public defender in Washington, D.C. at what was known then as the Legal Aid Agency. As a public defender, our primary job was to represent indigent people who were charged with crimes in the District of Columbia. Another aspect of our work was to bring civil actions against institutions where there were at least alleged constitutional violations, and this involved not only jails and and prisons, but also hospitals and other kinds of facilities. I was involved in the lawsuit against the District of Columbia Jail, which was really a hellhole at the time, and also the suit against the Lorton complex of reformatories in Lorton, Virginia. And I can remember, like it was yesterday, going to the District of Columbia Jail and meeting the superintendent for the first time. And I found him to be a very difficult person, very, very defensive, very gruff, not really particularly interested in compromising, and saw us in the lawsuit as the enemy. And so that was that unpleasant meeting with the head of the jail. And the next week I was scheduled to meet with the head of the Lorton prison system. And I just figured it's going to be more of the same. So I go out to meet John Boone, thinking that I'm going to see somebody like the superintendent of the jail. And it took me about 2 minutes to absolutely change my attitude as to what was happening and what would happen. I walked into his office. He looked at me, talked to me. It took about 2 minutes for me to realize that I was talking to a very compassionate, caring individual, somebody who was courageous, congenial, and especially clever. He looked at me and he said, "You know, I'm really kind of glad that you sued me." And that immediately it took me back. He said, "I'm glad that you sued me. And if we are clever about this, if we are clever about this, it's going to be a win-win situation. Because of this lawsuit, I will be able to get the resources necessary to improve the programming at in the Lorton prisons, which is and do the things that you want us to do because of the lawsuit. And also the judge in the case will undoubtedly issue orders that people in our department won't find particularly nice, but we'll comply with it. And so the judge will be essentially running cover for me, as providing cover for me as an administrator." And from there on in, I trusted him. He trusted me. The lawsuit worked out very, very well. And then for the next 2 years, John Boone was my colleague. I was his colleague. We started programs together at Lorton. We started the Lawyers to Lorton program, where I used my contacts in the District of Columbia Bar. We brought young lawyers out to the Lorton prisons one night a week in order to meet with inmates and their family members about civil problems that the families were confronting in the District of Columbia area, such as evictions and the like. John Boone would send inmates to the Federal City College in Washington, D.C. for educational programs. The only problem is their faculty didn't know very much about the things that the inmates were interested in. And so with John Boone's help, he and I recruited young lawyers from big law firms in Washington, D.C., and they became the free faculty for the programs. I had an opportunity to learn so much from John Boone and do so many things with him in the Washington, D.C. area. We were involved with what was known as the Shenandoah Conference, where there was a week-long meeting of people from all aspects of society and the criminal justice system. And at the very end, John Boone was our host. We all spent 2 nights and 3 days in prison, in different prisons. They spread us out throughout the system, and what an education that was for me, especially. When John Boone was recruited to come to Massachusetts, one of the things he said when he got here was that he wanted to bring along that lawyer from Washington, D.C., who was suing him. And so we made arrangements. I came a couple of days a week. I worked half-time as a defense lawyer in Washington, half-time here, working in the Boone inner circle for the first 2 or 3 months. And that was an education for me. He brought me here because he wanted me to work with him to do things that would prevent the kinds of lawsuits that were being generated around the country as far as the prison systems were concerned. I only got to do that for about 3 months or maybe 4 months because there were openings on the parole board. And I found that the design for me was to get me on the parole board and to get me to be chairman of the parole board so that I could work with John Boone in implementing the goals of Chapter 777, which was the community corrections piece of the legislative package that was going through. So then I was replaced by somebody who knew a lot more than I did, and he sits here in our audience today, and that's Bob Bell. And I hope that he'll come up here at some point and talk. But he really took over and was John Boone's lawyer for the remainder of John Boone's tenure. When I became chairman of the parole board, I then had this wonderful relationship, and we'll have an opportunity a little bit later this evening to talk about the impact that John's reforms had on me and on the rest of the system and on parole. I know that my time is limited here. I did want to talk about one other thing. Everybody certainly knows that John Boone faced certain racial barriers when he was here. People don't really realize that he also faced something that I call parochialism, parochial barriers, because back in 1970, Massachusetts, 1971, 72, was a very, very insular place. You hardly could ever come in from out of state and take over an agency or have a major position. It was too parochial. And as a matter of fact, it was thought by many people that the police, corrections, and parole were within the domain of the Irish, and that public service, public works was in the realm of the Italians, and that mental health in the realms of Jews, and that there were certainly other domains throughout the system. So if you are a Black person from Virginia coming into Massachusetts into a parochial Massachusetts, you really had problems. And that was one of the major problems. So I put that together with the racial issue to see the walls that John Boone faced. He shattered that wall of parochialism, and he, with the help of other individuals. But after John, it never happened again. I came in, I was chairman of the parole board, hardly an issue at all. When John Boone left the Department of Corrections, Frank Hall took over from North Carolina. There was no resistance to him. Those parochial walls really got broken down, and I think that we all owe a debt to Jim Eisenberg, to Peter Goldmark, to Governor Sargent, and to John Boone for really bringing us into a new age. Thank you.
All right. And that is a terrific segue to Jim Eisenberg, who's been referenced several times this evening. He's a former official in the state. Yep, please put the microphone in front. And he's going to be giving us some of his reflections and explaining his background at the time.
So thank you. Is this okay? Very good to be here. I was Peter Goldmark's assistant I had been, you'll excuse me, I had been brought from Berkeley. And I had studied criminology at the School of Criminology at Berkeley. And one of my first assignments, it's interesting listening to Commissioner Fitzpatrick and Jack Fitzpatrick and about his heart attack. I happened to be sitting next to him the day that happened. I guess now, 50 years later, I had a heart attack. So, knock on wood, I had tremendous respect for him, and I'm really glad he survived. But Peter asked me to lead a search to find a new commissioner of corrections from Massachusetts. And I was fortunate. I talked to a colleague I knew from California. I had worked at San Quentin as in the counseling area, and a man, Bob Montilla, was in DC, and he had then been deputy director, and he told me about a man named John Boone. And Peter allowed me. I went to DC and met with John. I went down one morning and I sat in on his staff meeting, and the level of respect with a very diverse group of men who worked for John was overpowering. And then I walked with John through Lorton Prison, just the two of us, and the respect from the men who were in the prison, who were the inmates for John Boone, was to me overwhelming and positive. And he was doing, as Judge Chernoff, or as Paul, my longtime colleague, says, John was doing some beyond innovative kinds of things in community corrections. And I came back and had a conversation with Peter Goldmark. And then Peter and I talked to the governor, and John was appointed commissioner. For me, I had a background in criminology, and before I actually came to Massachusetts and arrived here in 1971, I had studied at the University of Oslo, Norway, with two of the most internationally respected prison reform or rehabilitation people, Niels Christie and Thomas Mathieson. And they were leaders, and I was able to study with them for 5 months. So I had a real orientation about ideas around prison reform, and I had my own experience having worked at San Quentin. I would also say, just over the years since I've retired, I was executive director of actually a Massachusetts organization. I was the New York director for NAFI, which is an organization that does juvenile justice and child welfare work. I was very, very involved in keeping young people out of institutions and out of the system. I've done a lot of work with police on community policing and trying to reduce arrests with young people. I would say, I think it's important to remember John was essentially given only 2 years by Governor Sargent to complete any reforms. After years of work in the field for myself of criminal justice, I reflect on the Boone Era as a historic step in prison reform. Reform of the prison system required more time and continued patience about the many reform challenges that any leader may face as one moves to change the system. In addition to the link with time challenges of reform were John's organizational challenges. Certainly, Paul has outlined issues of parochialism and racism, but in addition, there were organizational challenges to find corrections leaders, other than, of course, the gentleman here today, who had the talent, understanding, and commitment to pursue a new vision of the corrections mission of rehabilitation and positive prisoner reentry back into communities. The development of this leadership was a challenge then, and in my mind remains a challenge today. I want to be respectful to Undersecretary Peck, but from my own experience, this is a challenge, and I appreciate this evening and this discussion to focus on developing, and I really appreciate Peter's comment about generational experience in terms of developing future leaders. Fortunately, in my mind, John was able to identify and work with many progressive people, including Paul and some dear friends who have passed away, who really created a first community corrections program in this state and I think in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to sort of complete our look at things that happened then and how they influenced the future, we have two other folks who are going to speak with us this evening. Louis Spencer is first. He's a former Massachusetts Correction Commissioner. He came on after the Boone years, and he can talk a little bit about his background and his experiences working after those reforms and that particularly turbulent time in our history. Louis?
Thank you, Deb. That means I'm the youngest person on the panel. I started in corrections in 1980, and I, like most people, never anticipated coming into corrections, but my brother was working in corrections, and because of the Boone era, there was a real big push to bring in more staff, more diverse staff, and some folks that I knew that I was familiar with got me to come in for an interview, got hired as a 19-year-old young, real thin guy. I started working in corrections. I went to an academy that I thought was done very professional with drill instructors at MCI Shirley. We slept there. We ate there in the morning. We worked out. We ran. We did academics together. We learned about rules and regulations and all the intricate parts about what it meant to work in a correctional environment. So the first phase of my career was I went from correction officer, and I consider myself a practitioner because throughout my career, I probably have done every single job within the correctional system, from a correction officer all the way up to captain. Captain was the last uniform position that I held. And so from correction officer to captain, I took a brief moment. I served in the United States Air Force, which was one of the best things I did, met my wife, and I think it really gave me an opportunity to mature. And when I came back into the Department of Correction in '85, they called me back because they were still looking for people. And I hesitantly went back and worked at MCI Norfolk. And I will tell you, working as an officer and part of my career at MCI Norfolk really shaped me as a leader, because a lot of the things that I hear my colleagues talk about the era of Boone, MCI Norfolk embodied that. It embodied communication, it embodied respect, it embodied an environment where the administration would have to meet with the inmate population. It had a self-governing aspects to it. Officers were involved in the classification piece, and there was incident reports, D reports, there was due process. So as an officer, that really shaped me throughout my career. And I went up to the ranks up to captain, and I worked in different facilities doing different aspects of the job. As a captain, I was at MCI Norfolk, and Governor Weld wanted to create the first boot camp in Massachusetts. I was assigned as the security specialist. And from that, I did that, ended up becoming a deputy superintendent, and I was a superintendent and MCI Lancaster, which is located in Lancaster, not to be confused with the Shirley Complex facilities. It was a co-ed facility. It was male and female, 300 to 400 beds. It had a lot of the progressive programs that I hear Jim talk about, and I hear some of my colleagues talked about. Community correction, that was my first experience in corrections as a superintendent. We did PRAs, which program-related activities. We did furloughs. We had sex offender programs. We had a lot of things that we say, what happened to it? Where is it going? Why don't we do it anymore? I will tell you that what I've heard throughout my career is that corrections is broken. I don't think correction has ever been broken. I think correction is constantly evolving. And if you look at the Boone era to now, I think if you really take a deep dive at it, we've evolved over the years. And there's a lot of different things I could point out to you, and maybe by the end of this session I will. From being a captain, I became a superintendent, and I learned a lot. I've seen a lot of the reforms that I hear my colleagues talked about. I implemented them, I embodied them, and I could see the end result. As a commissioner, I came to be a commissioner probably by accident, because I was asked to act, and then they did a nationwide search, and then someone said, "Why not you?" I did not want to do it, but I'm glad I did, because it really gave me an opportunity to become the leader that I think I am today. And as the commissioner, one of the things that really try to focus on was evidence-based practices, performance measures. You know what they say about performance measures? If you're not keeping scores, you're just practicing. Well, we didn't do that. We kept score, and we wanted to know what was working, what was not working. And what I found as the commissioner, working with, I think the head of probation, parole back then was Wall. I worked with Davis. I met with our former city mayor, Menino, and we cut a lot of the bureaucracy, and we started working together to really put some real creative ways to re-enter the inmate population back into society. And we did that by using evidence-based performance measures and just good old-fashioned collaboration. You know, got stakeholders together, and we cut through a lot of the noise. And one last thing that I would say, we really encourage outside stakeholders to come in. My colleague here and I were talking about, and we did what we refer to as dialogue. We use dialogue as an opportunity to identify problems and resolve issues, and we tried to spread that out throughout the department, and for both staff and inmates, and in the hopes that it would create a healing environment. So that's kind of a quick elevator speech about who I am and what my short career in the Department of Correction was. I got over 36, basically going on 42 years. I'm currently a executive consultant with Sheriff Katusian, and I do consultant and advise, and I've done it from Rikers to Hawaii to New Jersey to Tennessee. And so that's what I've been doing now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Louis. And next, to give us a little bit of his background, we're very pleased to have Undersecretary at the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, Andy Peck, with us. Andy, we are very pleased, and you're here with us, really, Andy. We invited you to come, and we're so glad that you agreed, because you really have a reputation as being a very solid, trustworthy person in the office. So thank you for joining us, and we're glad you're here.
Thank you. For inviting me. It's kind of humbling to sit up here and be with this group of people who, you know, the breadth of experience and knowledge, folks that have come before me. So it's special to be here. But I'm probably the second youngest on the panel. I think I was probably riding a big wheel when John Boone was the commissioner. But I have a background in community supervision. I have a clinical background, and it's interesting because I remember when this was proposed to me, and I'm like, John Boone, how do I know that name? How do I know that name? And 4 years ago when I started this job, a colleague of mine who had been around for 40 something years handed me a document. It was probably my first week on the job in this position. And it was a Harvard study on the reforms of John Boone. Needless to say, I went scurrying looking for it to my office somewhere. But, you know, there's two things that come to mind when I think about some of, you know, his philosophy and mine, and like the direction that I think we're going in, and it's humanizing and it's normalizing. So, you know, I think we spend a lot of time focusing on the problems that people have, as opposed to focusing on people who then have problems. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. You know, I am not, he was an abolitionist. I'm not an abolitionist. And my friend Stacy Borden in the audience and I, we have these conversations all the time. But I think what we do share is that, we should truly use incarceration for those people who are a real public safety threat. We shouldn't incarcerate people that we're mad at. So we invest a significant amount of money in a criminal justice system, in a carceral system, and we're nothing more than a downstream indicator than everything that's going wrong upstream. And then we invest a significant amount of money into a correctional system, and a carceral system, and a criminal justice system to fix those problems. So as I'm sitting here and I'm hearing about HHS and how it used to live under HHS, we have focused considerably on the social determinants of health and how those are related to behavior. And we try to, or are trying to, on a parallel track, focus on, the social determinants, housing, healthcare, education, employment, while also focusing on the criminogenic needs of folks. We can't expect people to be law-abiding. We can't expect people to, be released back to the community and have a whole host of parole or probation conditions and be able to follow them when they're hungry, when they don't have when they're worried about where they're going to lay their head at night or how they're going to provide for their kids. And, if we can, just move the dial a little bit and begin to focus on correcting some of those things, I think we'd be much more successful. And then really focusing on behavior change. Incarceration is finite, but behavior change is infinite. And that, if we can change behavior, and create environments in which people can transform, create environments, transformational environments, we can have lasting behavior change. And that is really true public safety. Other than that, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all. Thank you for the invite.
Okay, so that's where we're coming from, and we'll have a discussion with these folks about some of what was going on then and how that affects things now. And then we'll open it up to your questions. Again, if you in the live audience have a question, raise your hand, and we'll have someone bring you a microphone so you can pose your question to the panelists or panelist of your choice. And for those of you watching us remotely, joining us virtually, put your questions in the chat and I have access to them, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can in the very limited amount of time that we have left. So let's go back first before we look at current, and let's talk a little bit more about what was going on then, because it was such an important time. And I want to ask Jim Serco, because I felt like he said, and I went into the prison when the guards walked out, and I had to sort of oversee things and make sure that things went smoothly at that time. I wonder, Jim, if you could talk a little bit more about that, about going into Walpole at that time, this time that was really the time that led to the departure of John Boone. What happened?
Well, at the time, I was working at the Reception Diagnostic Center, which was a brand new facility. We were building it at Norfolk, but we began it at MCI Walpole. It was part of Chapter 777. And it was really the first time that classification in Massachusetts had a real focus, that we would bring inmates when they're first incarcerated, when they just get to Walpole, and look at what their progression through the system might be, starting in maximum security, working their way down to medium security and minimum security. And the goal was to eventually get people to pre-release centers where they could have furloughs. But at that moment in 73, when the correction officers walked off, people like Dave Haley and myself and about 14 others that were working in non-uniform jobs. We were counselors, we were assistant staff psychologists, we were social workers, and we were asked to go into the institution and run it. I didn't know what the heck that meant, but we were asked, and we got assignments in each of the blocks, and we were overnight from social workers interviewing new arrivals to, in my case, A2, which was a minimum security block at Walpole. On the first day, I was given my assignment, and on the second day, the Commissioner Boone, came in the evening, and he asked that all 576 inmates be brought to the auditorium so that he could address them. I don't know that that's ever been done before, but he gave a rousing speech. He told the inmates that the officers had obviously walked off. We could run the institution without the officers, that we were going to open up avocation the next day. We were going to our programs, and the inmates responded with a rousing applause. They found it to be exciting, and we wondered what that meant. The next day, I'm opening cells and walking around my block where I had Al DeSalvo was one of the inmates on my block, George Nasser, who had done 2 life bits, and wondering what I was supposed to do. It didn't come with a manual. And I'd open the cells and say, good morning, breakfast is on. And it was a challenging time because the inmates at that point basically were feeling as though they were going to run the institution. So what were we doing there?
Right.
Unlock doors, wait for noontime when folks could go to the mess hall. And it started off, it was pretty quiet. It was okay. It didn't take very long before the tensions started to rise. We were there for 8 days. There were fires being set. There was drugs. It became obvious that there was drugs being introduced to the institution. We had observers that we really didn't know. We knew they were from the community, but they didn't work for the Department of Correction. I don't know how they were screened or what their roles were, and they would walk around and take notes. We didn't know really who they were. We were screened. We knew that department employees had our assignments, and at one point I was given an assignment in the visiting room. And one of the inmates was being inappropriate with his girlfriend, and I asked him to stop. There were grandmothers in there, and it was inappropriate. And I asked him, stop. And he didn't. So I went up to him and asked him to leave the visiting room. His visit was over. And as he brushed past me, he said, you ever pull that again? It's 50 years later, so I don't remember what the second half of it was, second half of that sentence. But it was clear to me that he was sending me a message. Ron Traylor's block, during those 8 days, an inmate either had a hot shot or shot himself up, and he died on a toilet. So we knew that things were getting difficult. There had been, prior to that, during Commissioner Boone's administration, it was a year and a half, and there were 7 superintendents. And we went from total lockup with Perel for months on end and shakedowns of all of the cells where they came up with drugs and weapons. And imagine an institution that's locked up for months, a couple of months. We went from that to open society where there were no controls. So
it
I went back.
It starts orderly, but it doesn't last.
It starts orderly, but it doesn't end that way. So as things started to progress. In fact, one of my colleagues was told during negotiations with the inmates, half-heartedly, maybe if this doesn't go well, we'll take you hostage. Well, that may be funny 50 years ago, but in that context, it's intimidation. It was an intimidation. I don't know how he took that, but it's clear that the inmates began to let us know that we should leave the institution. In fact, George Nassar said to me, if I were you, kid, I wouldn't come in tomorrow. It was that clear to us that as we weren't trained as correction officers, we knew there was no one really in the institution to go to. If you want to discipline someone, who could that be? So the inmates were really in charge. And we asked to meet with the superintendent, and we told him it was getting too dangerous and it probably wouldn't end well. It didn't end well a couple of months later. He said, well, what if we ordered you back in? And we said we'd walk off. And we left the next day. We did not go back in. It took 2 months, but when an inmate cell was torched, the state police were called in.
Mm-hmm. And that was the end. It's such a dramatic time. And Arthur Bembury, you have an interesting perspective about this particular time. How would you describe it from where you were then?
Well, being on the inside, you have a different perspective because you're in the middle of whatever's going on. I want to say that regardless of what change people wanted, there's still this different energy going around that, as my colleague pointed to, violence, murder, drugs, and everything. So through it all, I just want to be clear about something too. I went to prison at 18. I think I got to Walpole when I was 19 in the middle of all this. When there's a riot, you're just in the riot. You don't pick sides. You know, I don't want to be here. You're in the riot. Okay, so you're there. You've seen a picture of me on screen with my arm up. That's because I was in the riot. The look from the inside was very dangerous. And I want to say that had a lot to do with the circumstances that had led up to the uprising at Walpole, because Attica had just happened recently. And while nobody wanted that, there was this feeling inside that that's what was going to happen. So there's this very tense energy going inside. And then you had your leaders inside of the prison, Ralph Ham, Bobby DeLello, 2 different areas. Ralph represented the African population, and Bobby DeLello represented the white population, if you will. So those 2 are coming together, and we're having planning meetings about what to do. Obviously, there's discussions about taking hostages and things like that. And we're just saying, well, we do want reform and we do want answers, but not at what cost? So everybody wasn't on the same page, but once the animal gets rolling, you're just there. You're assigned to a certain area of the prison that you have to watch. You have to do this, you have to do that. So it was very, it was challenging to want something, but not want it that particular way. To want your voice to be heard, but also to know that when the shooting starts, when the dogs come in and when the gas starts going off, your voice isn't being heard anymore. You're just seen as a problem that needs to be distinguished. And that is where we were at that particular point. Are we still going to be heard? Is all of this getting lost in everything that's going on? And at a certain point, it did.
I just want to follow up because negotiating with prisoners, and it seems that the prisoners were really trying to have a voice and to some degree did have a voice, right? At least in the beginning. Do you think something like that could happen today?
Do I think something like that could happen today? The violence?
No, the negotiating with prisoners and bringing prisoners to the table and making sure that in trying to, have those types of talks and have those voices heard.
I do think that could happen today. And one of the reasons that I know that it could happen today is because of the way the correctional system has changed over the years. We've had officers like Michael Grant, who's here. He's, for years, has been somebody that interacted with the inmate population in a way that was positive. Mr. Spencer, when he was there, they set a platform that gives you an ability to, the opportunity to speak to folks. You might not know this on the outside, but in prison there's something called happy hour.
Access hour. No more happy.
They changed the name. Access hour. It used to be called happy hour. That's where we could go and speak to
No happy hour.
all of the officers that were lined up, including the commissioner, and you could express any type of problem that you had, no matter what it was, even against another officer. If you felt you had a problem with an officer, you could walk up to at access hour and say whatever it is that you had to say. So because of that type of opportunities being presented, especially at Norfolk, and also because they are, if you will, each group is represented by a governing body. So you have a minority co-chairman, majority co-chairman. All of those groups are represented by different inmates, and they have the ability, they have the opportunity to speak to the administration about any issues that are going on. And I want to say this too, before I go any further, the push for education and the promotion of education inside of the correctional facilities is unheard of. It's just unheard of. We have now the organization that I work with partakers. We work with Boston University, Tufts University, Emerson, and Boston College. And they all have degree granting programs that are inside the prison to help people reach their full potential if they want to do that. So this is unprecedented where we are now. And it's all because of people that you have in front of you that are making sure that they step forward and step up to the plate as agents of change.
Well, let's ask Jim Eisenberg, if you would, a little bit about why do you think there was this interest in reforms in Massachusetts at the time? Was it in response to Attica and people were afraid, or were there, and all of the social unrest going on, or why? How do you see this push toward correctional reform in Massachusetts in the 70s?
I want to say I really appreciate the opportunity, as we were talking about 50 years ago, history. One of the things I didn't mention is that, and I think a number of my colleagues, about 5 years ago, I started a grandpa organization in New York. And I really appreciate this discussion when grandpa might get an opportunity to talk about history and reflect on events that happened in different lives. And so for me, hearing Peter tonight, his presentation, and tremendous respect for him, and knowing Paul Chernoff, the quality of leadership that he brought to the parole board in Massachusetts, was part of what was being looked at that point in early 1971, is there was a real look at what was reform. Even as Bob Cadigan talks about the Kerner Commission, one of the things that happened in 1968 with the Kerner Commission in this country was looking at the need for reform of the criminal justice system. They actually began to put money into reforming the system. It began to look at the opportunity of bringing in a different quality of leadership. And in this case, looking in corrections, I think, and I give the governor, sergeant, I give Peter, I have a lot of respect for them, looking and being open to a man like John Boone coming in, who had experience already beginning to reform the prison system, as Paul had said, down in Lorton, and developing, not just talking about it, but they were really looking at what are the programs, what are the initiatives, what is the meaning of having respect for men and women who may be in prison, and how to begin to support them in terms of a constructive and positive reentry back into the community. And of course, at the same time, one should look in Massachusetts. Jerry Miller was the Commissioner of Youth Services. He was taking a real initiative to close prisons with young people. One of my longtime colleagues who I just had dinner with last night, Dr. Yitzhak Hall, he was the leader of how to deinstitutionalize. They were thinking about how do you close these institutions. Mental health, I think, as Bob talked about it, they were looking at, is there a different way to treat people who have mental health issues? And I think what John brought to the state were specific. I appreciate the discussion of Walpole. God knows we all lived through it. I do. But in the meantime, all this was happening with Chapter 777. There was a man, Gary Robinson, who had grown up in Roxbury and Dorchester. Peter brought him in. He was Assistant Cabinet Secretary for Program Development. His initiative, working with John, was to set up programs, pre-release, set up the programs that put in place the reform. It wasn't just talk. All of this was happening simultaneously, including the reform of the parole board. But there's no question Walpole was a big challenge. But part of the challenge, and I think Jim talks about it, was both what was happening with the staff. Internally, there was tremendous internal politics, tremendous amounts of racism, tremendous, using Paul's term, parochialism. But there also were people who were very open and wanted, I know within the Human Service Administration, there were people who came to work there because they were looking to reform and change the system. And all of that was going on within a political environment, if you might remember, in Massachusetts, where there were issues with Louise Day Hicks around desegregation of schools, tremendous media influence going on. So I give the governor, I give Peter, and I give John tremendous amount of credit. And I think Peter's right. There were things that really worked, and there were things that sadly didn't. But it was a period of reform in this country. And John Boone was selected with the support of the governor and Peter to be the leader of that reform.
I'm going to just sort of breeze through a couple of things here so we don't run out of time. And so I think because we're on this issue of reform in Massachusetts, I want to go to you next, Jim, and tell us sort of, what were one or two key areas that were focused on then? And do we know if any of this worked? What's the data say about the effectiveness of these reforms?
The two most important aspects to Chapter 777, in my opinion,
put the mic a little closer,
were establishment of halfway houses, where an inmate they were contracted facilities with private nonprofits, where an inmate within 6 months of parole eligibility could be assigned. The second piece was pre-release centers, and they were very successful. Those are the two most important, I think, and successful parts of 777. There were other things that helped, but those, and minority hiring was an important part of Chapter 777, and classification improvements. But the aspect of sending someone through the system, here's what we found worked over many, many years, and the research department backs it up, and on our website you'd find that research analysis. But here's what we found worked through Chapter 777, with 40 or 50 years later. If you move an inmate from higher security when they're first committed in maximum security prisons, move them through the system where they earn MCI Norfolk, medium security, down to minimum security, then pre-release, and ultimately parole. It seems to us, based on the facts and based on the research, that worked. But what is pre-release? Pre-release in those days was an assignment by an inmate It's a totally different setting than any of your other institutions. It's wide open. There are no walls. The controls are internal. And every inmate who was coming through the system knew that they were close to parole. And setting them up with community services, not behind the walls community services, but in the community. They're going back. And 95% of the inmates who are incarcerated in every state in this country are coming back to the community. So the question is, and I think we answered it, how do you get them back in the best way that will keep them in society and not returning? And the statistics tell us that that's your best shot. But it's not being released from a major institution. It's being released with some support, encouragement. There were so many of the inmates who worked with us, worked through the system, found a job. We helped them to find jobs in the community. They had a furlough. And if you add those two things, a job and a furlough prior to release, Frank Carney will tell you that the statistics prove that that reduces recidivism rates beyond anything else you do in the system. You can't just let someone direct to the street. So those were the two things that were very successful.
Right. So I guess I wonder, I think, Judge Chernoff, this might be a question for you. So if we know that these things work, and we say that now, that reentry works, supportive services work, furloughs, dirty word in Massachusetts, may have worked at one time, but that policy changed after Willie Horton in the 1980s. And Willie Horton, for those of you who don't know, was someone who was on furlough in Massachusetts, and he escaped and committed a violent crime. So that essentially ended the furlough program in Massachusetts. So what I think, to me, that says, what about political considerations when these reforms are going forward? Everybody might agree that these things are helpful. Everybody might see the data, right, that show that this may help in the long run. But when you've got a highly charged political case, your political leaders might do something different. So, Judge? Sure.
We know that Willie Horton really changed the landscape. It cost Michael Dukakis the presidency. That, first of all, tells us what an impact it had nationwide, not just in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It turned the correction system and the rehabilitation system on its head. It used to be that we all understood the catch-22, and that is people on the lower end of the criminal spectrum, the property offenders. Those were people who had the highest rate of recidivism, and those people who were the more serious offenders had a much lower rate of recidivism afterwards. And lifers who got paroled and who were put in responsible positions, it was almost a zero recidivism rate as far as they were concerned. What the Willie Horton case did was to put everybody on the defensive in the institutions, and because of the strong political pressures, and suddenly the people who had earned the trust of the administration, and they were in the inmates, and they were in minimum security, they all got called back into the institution, and things became very difficult. They became very hard for parole, because what responsible parole decision-making involves how well the person is doing in the institution. To me, as a member of a parole board and parole board chairman, how many successful furloughs an individual had was a very important consideration for parole. How well a person did on work release, how well a person did in a pre-release situation. All of these things were really good measures for determining how the person would do on the outside. And the Willie Horton situation just absolutely turned it on its head. The people, there were no furloughs, there was people were put behind the walls. The people who were being released were the property offenders, and they were the people with the highest recidivism rate. And so it really was destructive. I thought that we were always very proud of our commutation system in Massachusetts, and that is for select lifers, governors would accept petitions for commutation, which would reduce the sentence, make them parole eligible at some point, and not many people disappointed society who went through, who were lifers, who were eventually paroled. That came to an end with Willie Horton, and I think we went for 30 years without a commutation. And I think it was just Governor Baker commuted the sentence of 2 people, and Willie Horton was 1986. I don't think there was any commutation from 1986 into 2023. That's a pretty big impact that Willie Horton had on all of us.
Right, right. And so if we're moving forward, and we're trying to move quickly now because we don't want to run out of time and we want to make sure the audience can ask questions, let's go to the future. This is the history. This is what we were dealing with. These are the reforms. These were some of the obstacles to reform. But I wonder, Louis Spencer, as former commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Correction and now someone who consults with other correctional leaders, what do you think is lasting from this time? And who are some of the leaders today, do you think?
Well, the things that are that we've talked about that used to be in place back from when the Boone Era, a lot of those things are in place. And like I indicated, correction's not broken, it's evolving. And so when Jim talks about moving an inmate through minimum, pre-release, maximum, down to the lowest, all that works. Research has shown that. But what happens is that, and what shapes corrections, it's not us, the professionals or the practitioners, it's public opinion. Our mission in correction is public safety. And public safety today was interpreted differently back in the 60s. And it was, I think every 5 years, it takes a different shape of what public opinion is. So we could have furloughs, we could have minimum security, we could have work release, but the public tolerance for when it fails, if we in corrections, a lot of time we joke around. We said if we had the batting average of 80 or 90%, right, that we do in corrections of all the things that we do right that works, we'd be making millions of dollars. But in corrections, you have to have 100%, because if anything short of that, it becomes a political nightmare for whoever is running for office. The other adage is corrections don't win elections, they lose elections. And unfortunately, the people that pay for that are the people that we're charged with trying to create an environment, a healing environment, an environment where they could correct their behavior and go back into society. And with that said, there are a lot of people out in nationally, and I would say in Massachusetts, and I don't know if I'd call them true reformers, Deb, but what I would say, Ann Pritchett, she's the Missouri Department of Correction director, Randy Liberty, who's in Maine, Brian Collier, who's in Texas, Josh Tewall, who's in Idaho, and a former colleague of mine who was here, Harold Clark. And there are many others. There's a young woman in Ohio. There's a young man that just got hired in Nebraska. There are a lot of individuals, and I don't know if I'd say they're true reformers, but they're all doing things that fall into the umbrella of reform. For instance, nationally, some of the things I'll just touch base on it quickly, mental health and substance abuse treatment, that's happening everywhere in corrections today. And it's happening for inmates and it's happening for staff. Because what we realize is that trauma-informed care doesn't just affect the inmate population, but it affects staff. And it even takes place in the juvenile system, and those individuals end up graduating, coming into our system. Medical assistant treatment programs, MAT, Sheriff Katusian, who I do some work there, but I know it happens in the DOC and it's happened throughout the country. MAT treatment programs, and that was a result of a court case, and we're all jumping on and doing that. We're actually doing treatment in our prisons and actually stepping down. Hiring and retention is a big problem right now. Getting the right people into our system and be able to retain them. It's in every industry. We pay very well in Massachusetts. We have very good benefits, but the new youth that's coming in, the new generation, they want more. They want a voice. They want to be more involved. So we may have to reinvent correction. We need to reinvent how we do it. Staff wellness programs. One of the core values in the DOC, and I believe it still is integrity, honesty, and one of the key part. There's one of the key parts, caring. What does that mean? That means that you have to care for yourself, you have to care for each other, and you have to deal with people in a way that is being transformed in the whole. And that was the reason I always referred to creating a healing environment within our system, not just for the inmates, but also for staff. Suicide prevention, not just for inmates, but for staff. The numbers are up there. I talk about performance measures, and if you're keeping tab, you'll see that those numbers are up there. A lot of people are doing a lot of good things in there. The new sheriff from Bristol County, working with Lindsay Hayes, Sheriff Katusian, the DOC. Lindsay Hayes is a nationally known person, and he has brought a lot of good ideas, and those being implemented right here in our state. Evidence-based program, point-based classification. You talk about minimum pre-release, and how do you do that? You have to do it with a centralized classification system that is built around science, that ultimately ensures that you get the right people at the right place so that you give them the right opportunity. Now, it's not 100%. You can have failures, but it's up to us probably to educate the public on what that means and find out what that exception is. Restrictive housing is the ADSEG isolation, probably one of the big things that I've worked on both nationally and also locally with Middlesex, and I know the department's probably working on it, is to basically make administrative segregation become restrictive housing and have some key reform components to it, which we passed recently. We talked about education, risk needs assessment, PREA standards to make sure that, prison Rape Elimination Act, and also stay committed to national standard, ACA, NCCHC, and other accreditation. That ensures that we're meeting minimum standards within our system. Thank you.
Andy Peck, when you hear about this history and the reforms that were going on at the time and the challenges, where are we now? How would you describe it? And how would you describe maybe a key reform effort that's taking place in the department right now?
The commissioner mentioned restrictive housing. So the department eliminated restrictive housing just about a year ago. It was a goal of not only mine, but Commissioner Michi when we started. And the goal was to look at restrictive housing and how we could phase our way out of that system. We contracted with a correctional behavioral health group out of Chicago called Falcon. They came in, did about an 18-month assessment, provided us with a number of recommendations. We've adopted almost all of those recommendations. There is, certainly a debate and dialogue from folks on whether or not, it's the true elimination. I can tell you that they have significantly more time out of cell. They have significantly more congregate activities. They have access to education, to treatment. We are focusing on which the department never did before, and I understand that some other departments are similar. Is that we would put someone in restrictive housing, to discipline them for an offense, but we would never focus on what the cause of that behavior was. So we've really added and we've invested a significant amount of money into the treatment aspect of that and being able to identify what the causes are and then plugging in interventions to address those, the needs in what's driving the behavior to ultimately reduce, the reliance on any type of removal from general population. We have committed a significant amount of effort and money in investing in improving education and opportunities for education. We've invested $13.9 million in tablets, so everybody in our custody has a tablet. We've invested money in an online learning platform, so folks will be able to access not just education, but treatment synchronously and asynchronously. They'll have access to content 24 hours a day. We just opened a computer coding program. We've partnered with the Last Mile out of California in MCI Shirley. I was in there Monday morning. It is a state-of-the-art computer lab. And a lot of the instruction is done remotely. We are committed to reducing the brick and mortar footprint. The context of all of this conversation is around Walpole. That prison's going to close very soon. Closing the DDU. When we started this process about a little over a year ago, we had about 130 folks still inside the DDU, a very restrictive environment. There's less than 30 right now. That will be closed when we close. They're the only people left in that prison right now.
Next year closes, right? Is that right?
That's the timetable. I think we might exceed that. We are putting body-worn cameras on correctional officers. So, probably in the next year and a half, every correctional officer will have a body-worn camera. So it's a demonstrated commitment to transparency, to accountability, but it's also creating a safer environment. We've talked about some of the issues that, the trauma that goes on inside there. And listen, it's a difficult environment for everybody, people who live there, people who work there. This will create a safer environment. We, a year and a half ago, opened the Brave Unit. The Brave Unit is a very specialized housing program for young folks, 18 to 25, who are parents. We essentially took corrections and turned it right on its head. It's based on restorative principles. There's kind of this joint governance inside with the staff and the incarcerated people. They live together in a community. They educate together in a community. They have circle groups. I've been inside there. It's actually pretty remarkable. Slowly, we'd like to replicate not so much the Brave Unit, but the principles of the Brave Unit to another housing unit. We've engaged, because I believe very much in the power of impacted people. We started a credible messenger program. We have 5 folks who were formerly incarcerated. We're about to hire 3 more who work for EOPS. They don't work for the DOC. They don't work for parole. They don't work for probation. They work for us. And they are people who have a shared experience, right? They've walked in the footprints of the people coming out of the prison, and they have a very special, unique bond, one that, I'd never be able to reach some of these folks. And it's support, right? It's not, hey, you have to do this. It's driven by these folks. They kind of identify what the issues are. It's a 1-year engagement for these people. We also, we're starting to really look at restorative justice. We recently hired a director of restorative justice at EOPS. He's another individual, served 12 years in the Department of Corrections. And really trying to look at and reimagine and look at other pathways to holding people accountable. Accountability comes in different shapes and sizes. It's different from everybody. There's not that one size can fits all approach. So We've started restorative circles inside our prisons. We've started victim dialogues. So we're making some progress. No doubt about it. We still got some work to do, but some of that change is actually occurring.
Okay.
How much does that job pay?
Which one?
I just want to make sure, because we're really out of time, unfortunately, but I want to make sure we can get in a question or two. If anyone in the live audience has a question, you could raise your hand and someone would bring a microphone over. Question, anyone? Yes. Mic is on its way. And let us know if there's a particular panelist who you would like to answer your question.
Whoops. An interesting story that people, you guys, don't really know, and those that do know, keep their mouth shut. Prior to 1970, there were maybe 2 murders in Walpole. After 73, there were maybe 2 or 3 murders in Walpole. What caused 20 murders in that period of time? What caused it is the institution at that time was using drugs to control the population, and it blew up in their face. They had prisoners on 80 milligrams of Adderall a day. That's speed. You're on that for 2 weeks, you're paranoid as hell. That's what caused the murders. The other problem was putting drug addicts and drug dealers in the same block. That's insanity. They're going to buy guards. A drug dealer has the money to pay a guard off to bring in the drugs. If I said to a, and I have to cop out to it, I dealt with guards. I brought drugs in through guards. I bought stuff.
We should tell folks who you are.
I'm sorry.
We should tell folks who you are.
Oh, my name is Bobby DeLello. I was the first president of the Prisoners Reform Association. A real pain in the ass.
Okay, so I guess efforts to root out institutional corruption and how that might affect things. Lou Spencer, I mean, what do we do about that, right?
Yeah, well, I would tell you that a lot of things. Number one, part of what I think Boone wanted was professional. They wanted people to be well trained, wanted regulations, policies, and procedures. And I could tell you that when I became superintendent, one of the key things that I saw happening within the Department of Correction was we had a commissioner that came from the feds, and he centralized everything. He centralized the internal audits, internal policies and procedures, and with that, it brought accountability. And when there was a problem at a facility, he would shift superintendents based on our talents and our skill sets to places where there were problems. Number two is that we developed an intelligence gathering system, what they refer to as inner perimeter security. That was something that evolved over a period of time. They worked with both staff and inmate population, and information was able to flow back and forth. That made the prison a lot safer. Doing good basic tool control, key control, caustic, and just some real basic things. When I started as an officer, and I used to sleep at the prison at MCI Norfolk, but before I went home, I used to have to shake my shoes off because we had cockroaches throughout our correctional system, and something very simple corrected that. What happened? You had a lot of old facilities, and you had cockroaches, but we got a contract with an exterminator. It eliminated that. A clean, safe environment, right, allows us to do what is the best security in running prisons, and that's good programming. Good programming is good security. In order to do that, you have to, inmates and staff have to feel safe.
Right.
And
Arthur, you want to say something? It looks like. Arthur Bembury, do you want to say something about this sort of
There's
institutional?
just a couple of roaches in my cell, but that's cool.
Andy Peck, in answering that question, and again, Bobby DeLillo is talking about something that happened 50 years ago, but it certainly, in a Hollywood version of what happens in correctional facilities, there is some institutional corruption. What would you say, very briefly, because we're keeping folks here past our time, about how the department deals with that today?
So I will start with kind of echoing the commissioner's comments about good programming, good education. It makes a significant difference, but it also comes down to, having, identified your mission, your vision, creating, kind of your philosophy and the ideals and traits that you want in staff, and being able to recruit those particular staff. So it's recruiting, it's training, it's good policy, it's good supervision, and supervision meaning, that formal supervision between supervisor and staff. That relationship should be based on education, skill building, just checking in, being able to have a relationship where you can talk about, difficult things, and accountability. Accountability is critically important. And then also being, creative, and having creative management strategies too. I think we got to really kind of think outside the box when it comes to managing our folks.
Okay. Right, another question. Mike is on its way over.
Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is LaTanya Henderson. I'm a formerly incarcerated woman. And it took me a very, very, very long time to be able to say that out loud, especially in a room full of strangers. It was just the stigma that came with it and all of the things that society frowns down on. So more than a question, I had a comment that I was listening to the panel, and you gentlemen were talking about jobs, and when they come home, they need jobs. And when we come home, we need housing and different things like that. And that is 100% true. However, I just believe that if we don't get to working on those individuals that are inside while they're still inside, you can give them any kind of job. And it's not necessarily so that they will rise to the occasion. I don't care if it's teaching school, building a house, shining shoes. If we're not working on the behavioral changes, and I heard someone on the panel talk about that, you have to make sure that these people, that we understand about the changes that society has taken. We have to understand about our own behaviors and triggers and things that make us snap as individuals, and what is it that's making us, be so short-fused, or that will turn us back to, offenses. And someone on the board said a hungry person is going to do a lot of things as well as a cold or a tired person as well. But I just want to reiterate on this. This is really important before the door opens. We have to get some stuff in there where folks can identify, first of all, not seem like smoke is being blown up, or antiquated resources. You're giving them all these resources, but when they get home, these programs are closed down. They're not doing what they said that we do and things like that. So I just wanted to reiterate on that. Let's start on the inside before we get out so that we have a better chance at being a successful, what do they say, productive member of society, right?
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Not an easy thing to say. So I appreciate you doing that. And it sounds, at least from what our panelists have told us tonight, that there is some effort to try to improve that, to make sure that folks are more successful when they get out. So I appreciate your question. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I will take one more short question. Who's got a short question?
Oh boy, now we have multiple people. There you go.
Okay.
Did you want to go?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
I want to go because I was also, I was chief counsel under the administration of John Boone. And I won't speak to the legal issues that we dealt with, but one observation that came up during the conversation, we're talking a lot about what should happen in the institution, but I think people need to remember that one of the, and I think Jim Serco mentioned it, one of the things that John was most, was one of his goals was his belief that there were probably only 10 or 15% of the people who needed to be in an institution. And the issue was, if you're really going to do community corrections, you start on the front end. And it's the conversation that is being held all the time about what do you do with mental health and how do you deal with community mental health and how do you not put people in institutions, but what's the community's responsibility to assure that they can protect their citizens out in the community before they get to an institution. And by doing that, you also reduce the numbers. And again, I've been out of this area since probably 1975. So I've come back into it because of this relationship, my relationship with John and his work. But one thing I have noticed, and people have talked about it a lot in Massachusetts, that the numbers of people that are in institutions now is significantly reduced. And I would assume part of that reason is because there's a lot of things that are going on to keep people out on the front end. And I think one of John's hopes and dreams was always to do as much as possible to keep people out in the front end, not to bring them into a court and then move them through the system to an institution. And I would suspect there probably are lots of people, even though the problems are difficult, there are lots of people that don't have to be institutionalized, and there need to be all kinds of services available where the community is holding up its bargain or its responsibility. We're all big one community, and we've all got to help each other just as well as people who have created problems need to be responsible and help themselves.
Right.
Anyway, I think that's just important. And that was a huge part of John's, of what John wanted to see. The last thing I will say is, I live in Atlanta, Georgia. John grew up in Atlanta, his family's in Atlanta, and I've been blessed, my wife and I have been blessed after John went back to Atlanta, where he and I and his family are continuously in touch and talking with each other. And John Boone, for me, was one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met in my life.
All right.
His character, his leadership, his faith was just extraordinary.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, thank you. I think we have to end on that note. As we said, we were going to try to get as much information out as possible. There is a website where you can read more if you'd like to learn more. And I do believe that Jim Eisenberg wanted to make a quick comment before we leave. Jim?
Well, I think in the spirit of what Bob had said, and I really appreciate all the panel. I appreciate Boston University convening us tonight, and I really appreciate meeting Undersecretary Peck and hearing about what's happening. I just wanted to take a moment and thank John for the opportunity for us to reflect on his experience tonight and all the discussion that has come from it, and hopefully changes coming in the future. And I also want to, as part of this discussion over the last year, want to acknowledge and appreciate John's family, who are in Atlanta and who have been very, very supportive of this discussion. And we've tried to stay in touch with them, both Bob and I. John and I were longtime friends. And when I think John is respectfully remembered by many people in this room, but I think one of the things we found in John's funeral, the level of respect by men and women who had been offenders and ex-offenders for all of the work that he did, for all of the energy and support that he put in to demonstrate that there can be reform, there can be change of the corrections institution in this country, in this society. And I think, as Peter said, the reality is now, and I appreciate it, is onwards. How do we continue the reforms? How do we continue the vision of John Boone and move forward in the coming years? And thank you very much for including me and for this evening. And thanks to all of you who came here tonight to join in this reflection.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think we'll have a brief reception outside if anyone wants to join us, and you may be able to have time to ask some of the questions
good
that
luck
I'm
as you
sorry we
guys
didn't get to. But thank you all very much.
You know, nationally, we're spending money.
You're getting like kids.